Hello, Cardstack community. My name is Chrissy. I'm the founding director of the Cardstack project, coming to you from the land of the Web3. Today, I'm so delighted to be joined by Synthetix founder Kain Warwick, who's going to talk about how he has built and also evolved this protocol, one of the most important protocols on the Ethereum ecosystem. Welcome, Kain.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on and talking about a very important aspect of DeFi. We define Web3 a little bit broader than that, includes like DAOs and NFTs and stuff like that. But obviously, DeFi is what started it all, to make people realize a useful application can be built on top of the Ethereum blockchain and be able to bring actual utility and usage that is only imagined in people's head when we're talking about Bitcoin, but actually implemented in the EVM ecosystem. Can you tell us a little about your journey thus far in Web3 crypto blockchain and what made you start this Synthetix project?
Yeah, so I started out, I built a payment gateway that allowed people to purchase Bitcoin for cash in Australia. That was, I think, 8 years ago now. And then I kind of got, deeper into the Ethereum ecosystem around about the time of the DAO, and realized that, this is going to be a huge, change in kind of how we build applications and how we interact and coordinate. And so basically early 2017, I was like, the thing that's missing in the space, particularly in Ethereum, is stablecoins, right? We're using ETH for everything, and started designing a stablecoin protocol, which was called Haven. We launched that in 2018, which was right around the time when like USDC and TrueUSD launched, and even DAI launched a little bit before that. And so we realized in 2018 during the bear market that in order to kind of differentiate ourselves, we're going to need to do something a bit more than just a stablecoin. And so that's when we pivoted to Synthetix and built this kind of more generalized synthetic asset platform, which supports gold and silver and Bitcoin and all kinds of other assets, as well as futures markets and shorting and just a bunch of different things over and above just like a US dollar stablecoin.
People who are new to the kind of like Ethereum ecosystem, would learn about usually something simple like a certain token or certain types of stable coin. Those are pretty easy to understand, the native asset like ETH. But when you get to like synthetic assets, it's like, oh, that's like advanced level 2, right? You have to upgrade to it. So someone who is kind of roughly new to the kind of the asset side in this space, how would you describe like the generalization? Like, what is a synthetic asset? What's your definition, and how does that relate to the protocol ability to create these assets and manage them?
So I think it's actually interesting because most of the stablecoins people interact with are kind of synthetic, right? Even like USDC, it is a synthetic asset. So synthetic, calling something a synthetic asset can make it sound more complicated than it actually is. Really, what it is just a token on Ethereum that gets its value from something else. Right. So in the case of, DAI, it gets its value from a bunch of collateral in the form of, ETH and USDC and all these other things. In the case of USDC, the USDC token gets its value from a bunch of, dollars and other instruments in a bank somewhere that's being custodied by, Circle, right? But, USDC is not a real dollar, right? Like it's just a token. It's a representation of something. So all of these tokens are just representations of something, and they have mechanisms to maintain that value that they represent. And Synthetix is no different, right? Synthetix has different tokens that represent the price of Bitcoin or Ether or Doge or whatever thing it is that you want. And the reason why that's useful to have is the same reason why stablecoins are useful, right? It's useful to have dollars on a blockchain or things that act like dollars on a blockchain. It's useful to have things that act like Bitcoin on Ethereum, right? Because people want to trade Bitcoin on DEXs. They want to hold Bitcoin, in their Ethereum wallet, but they don't want to necessarily interact with the Bitcoin blockchain. And so it's a way for people to interact with these different tokens and have different values without need to leave Ethereum.
Right. So there's a lot of tools, like, for example, using example of Bitcoin, right? You can put Bitcoin in a centralized custodian. They can give you an IOU for the Bitcoin, not naming name of the thing. There are people who use threshold cryptography to do that. Then there's certain other people who are kind of come up with a new way to do it. So what's unique in the synthetic protocol to make like your Bitcoin the one that people should use if they want to kind of interact with Bitcoin and Ethereum or Ethereum related blockchain?
So I think everything's trade-offs, right? So, if your trade-off is that you want really tight coupling between the price of Bitcoin and the price of your Bitcoin token on Ethereum, then a custodial solution is actually fine, right? If you're not that worried about the custody side, the counterparty risk of someone holding the Bitcoin, that's totally fine. Synthetix opts for a different set of trade-offs. So what we want is something that is fully decentralized, that doesn't require anyone to hold an asset. It's all done via smart contracts on Ethereum. So also we don't use USDC, for example, right, as collateral for that exact reason. Because if you use USDC as collateral, then ultimately the value of USDC comes from a custodian holding dollars or holding dollar-like instruments in a bank somewhere, and we want to avoid that. We want to be purely decentralized and purely on-chain. So the only kind of off-chain aspect of Synthetix is the fact that we use oracles from Chainlink to push the prices of assets. Other than that, everything is contained on-chain.
So it's interesting, you look at USDC and people were surprised to say DAI, which is one of the stablecoin most popular, has some USDC deposit and maybe in the future even actual bank deposits on it. So do you think that this idea of custodial asset inside these DeFi protocol is causing kind of more centralization? Is it something that DeFi founder has to look out for to maintain that decentralization, almost like trying to make sure that everything you're doing is fair trade underneath what you're doing to make sure that your source is fair trade or non-custodial in this case within the field? Is that important, or is that becoming less and less important as you say, Circle's good, they chill?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the 1,000 days in the life of a turkey, right? USDC is all well and good up until the point where it isn't, right? And the problem with USDC is that it is custodial, and they do have a blacklist that they can put addresses on. They can, they can lock assets. They can do it arbitrarily. There's no, intermediation process. You can't appeal to them to, unlock your assets or whatever, unless you're,
I can email them.
Institutional
support@circle.com.
Yeah, I know, right? And I wonder how that will work out for you. So again, I think what it comes down to is, what are you optimizing for, right? If you're optimizing for like efficiency or price parity or something like that, if you're optimizing for scalability, then USDC is a very scalable solution, right? Because all you need is dollar demand, and you just put dollars in a bank and you just print more USDC. So in that sense, this is part of the reason why Maker got addicted to USDC, right? Because they were having trouble scaling. There was too much demand for DAI and not enough collateral. People didn't want to lock all of their ether as collateral. And so the peg started to dislocate. And so then the solution was, well, let's just jam a bunch of USDC in there. Now that, again, sounds great on paper as a short-term scaling solution, provided you don't have this tail risk of USDC locking your assets. But that tail risk exists, and now we've seen that not only is it tail risk, but it's actual practical risk that has happened now, multiple times where USDC has blacklisted addresses. And realistically, if you're optimizing for decentralization, then you really can't have USDC in your protocol. I think that there's, it's an obvious conclusion of the last week of activity, right? So Synthetix has gone even further to say, not only will we not use USDC as collateral, we actually won't even use DAI as collateral, because DAI is effectively a wrapped version of USDC. And so even the low risk of all of the USDC in DAI being locked, it's still too high a risk for us. it's an existential threat to the protocol. We want to be fully on chain and we want to be fully decentralized. And that means that you can't rely on custodial assets or custodial collateral. And that's just an ideological decision that the Synthetix community has made and pretty much stuck to, other than a period of about a month where we dabbled with using DAI as collateral on Optimism to try and relieve some critical peg issues, which we thankfully were able to unwind. We've avoided centralized collateral, and right now there's no centralized collateral in the protocol.
I think that's something that like the community, especially your community, is well informed, but other communities has to understand that this is a trade-off, that they have to make those decisions. And a lot of times, DAI is a Ethereum-based stablecoin, and they forget that you have to do like supply chain trace back until the origin and to say, hey, are you willing to take this risk on this product? Maybe. Yeah, where did it come from? Yeah. So, you mentioned optimism. Obviously, you're one of the person who is most enthusiastic, early supported before that's a thing, to say, layer 2 scaling has to be a thing. And the security model, Ethereum, is not incompatible with the scalability need for protocol. How's your feeling about your early bet? And with these kind of growing steps and supporting DAI, unrounding them, how are you feeling about the Synthetix protocol on 2 networks, with significant liquidity?
The challenge of supporting multiple networks is very different to the challenge of supporting a single network, right? It's not like a quantitative difference; it's a qualitative difference. You really need to think quite differently about it, and that's factoring in, that you're using an L2 rollup, which is very much within the Ethereum kind of security structure, I guess, right? As soon as you go out to like other L1s, the attack surface and the risk profile just increases, significantly. So we made a decision to kind of stay within the Ethereum ecosystem, within Ethereum scaling, and as a community, I think it probably hurt us a little bit. Because building a new network and kind of scaling that network up is challenging. It takes time, and so that investment in time is only now starting to pay off, I think, and it probably won't be fully realized even for maybe like another 6 months or even another 12 months. But I do think eventually the market will realize that like this is the place that we should be investing our efforts into. But you have to have high conviction to be able to maintain that in the face of kind of contrary information for a while, which I think for much of the bull market of the last 18 months to 2 years, the alt L1 thesis was kind of dominant. But I think we're now in a position where it feels like Ethereum scaling is starting to kind of reassert itself.
Do you think that obviously Rollup is kind of like what we have today? It's kind of like a shard. It would be very nice if protocol choose one and share liquidity and composability on one thing. Are you seeing that happening in Optimism? Are you looking at other rollups or other technology? I mean, not only the way they do consensus and programming, but also the presence liquidity, which is at the end of the day what it bottoms out and when you're trying to build a DeFi ecosystem. Do you see Optimism winning out?
Yeah, we've got Arbitrum, we've got Optimism, we've got some very early zero knowledge scaling solutions that are composable. Obviously, we have Starkware, which is done an exceptional job over the last 2 years supporting a bunch of different protocols. But you kind of trade off composability with Starkware. StarkNet is different, but it's still very early. So I think realistically, in terms of like Ethereum scaling today, and Ethereum scaling that stays within like the security mandate of Ethereum, you really have like Optimism and Arbitrum are the two kind of dominant choices. And it's going to be a pretty hard-fought battle, I think, over the next 6 months between those two networks to try and maximize liquidity and maximize, usage on those networks. But even still, I think if we end up in a situation where the vast majority of kind of block space, and execution moves off L1, even to both of those networks, even if those networks shared 50%, we'll get to a position where like the induced demand from confidence in those two networks will allow for Ethereum to scale significantly more than it otherwise would. So even if we don't have consensus on like which of the two roll-up networks is going to be dominant, I still think in 6 months' time, or a year's time, or whatever, the majority of activity will be happening on those two rollups combined, which will be a much better place than we are today, where still the vast majority of activity happens on L1, and the vast majority of liquidity is on L1, obviously.
Yeah, it's the analogy sometimes I use about Ethereum and the future of Ethereum and the roll-up and stuff like that. It's like what's behind me, right? Manhattan is like Ethereum, and there's many suburbs, many boroughs that you can go to, and it's all good. Like no matter where you go, there will be different communities, but it's still there's a place for them to share. What does it mean to be in this city that never sleeps and a blockchain that never stops, right? The question that I have about fees, right? So, one of the theses you have is that, the ability for a network to pay fees and feel like it's worth it is going to be the new measure that is much more close to sustainability. Do you think that the fees on Optimism and Arbitrum and Combine and whatever the totality of it, it's going to be something that you will see growing for not only your protocol but is it going to be low enough for it to be usable, and is it going to be high enough to show that there's demand?
So I think there's two types of fees, right? You've got fees for block space. On L1, obviously the fees that Synthetix is paying are significantly higher, right, than the fees that Synthetix, the protocol, is paying on Optimism. But then you've got the fees that users of the Synthetix protocol pay,
right?
And users pay those fees in US dollars in the form of SUSD, right, our dollar stablecoin. And when you look at that, the majority of the fees being generated and being paid by users for the protocol itself are still happening on L1. It's getting close. Some days, it's a little bit higher on L2. We need to get that to a point where, 95% of the fees are coming from L2, right? That's the goal. Like we need to get 90, because in order for us to really be able to say that we're scaling and that we can, support the protocol's growth for the next, 2, 3, 4 years, if the majority of activity is still on L1, that's not a viable scaling path. Like we've seen that L1 gets to a point where it's just not viable for everyone to be using it simultaneously. We need a pathway where everyone is confident enough, right? And people don't have, 1 foot in each camp, where they're still kind of hanging out on L1, waiting to see if L2 works, whatever. We really need everyone to kind of lean into this L2 narrative and say, okay, no, we're going to bring all of our transactions over to L2, because that's where we get our 10x or 50x or 100x scaling. We're not getting, even 2x scaling on Ethereum in the near future.
Yeah. Is it important to use incentives to get people to move over? What are the you mentioned about narrative, and obviously meme is one type of narrative. Is there like a meme to move people to L2, especially if they feel like L1 is doing what they need to do from as a trader, as a person? How do you get them to like get off and then just ride the bike across the bridge, so to speak?
Yeah, I know, right? It's a tough question. I think, I've said this a few times now. We were probably lulled into a false sense of security in terms of how easy it would be to move liquidity through DeFi summer. We saw crazy movements of liquidity between smart contracts during DeFi summer. Hundreds of millions of billions of dollars would just overnight go from one contract to another, right? With the right incentives. And so I think that some of us saw that and said, oh, incentives will fix this problem, right? With the right incentives, we'll get people to migrate. And we've begun to see that, like the OP incentives that exist now are starting to have an impact, but there's no question that it is a different challenge to migrate liquidity from L1 to a rollup than it was to migrate liquidity between two contracts on L1. It's probably an order of magnitude harder, which means that it's going to take much longer to happen. It's going to require a higher level of confidence in people that are interacting with these contracts, that are interacting with bridges, that are interacting with the network itself. But I think we will get there. And I think once we reach that tipping point in confidence, then the shift will happen and it will be quick. But we're still not quite there yet.
Do you think the consistent hacks of bridges and people losing funds as bridge attack is causing the loss of confidence and perpetuating the fact that you shouldn't get on a bridge?
It's a bit ironic, right? Because not all bridges are the same. So the bridge between Optimism and Ethereum is very different to some of the bridges that have been hacked over the last year, right? But a bridge looks like a bridge looks like a bridge, right? Unless you're a bridge designer,
the drop down looks the same, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? Like even a real world bridge, right? If you show me 10 different bridges, like, okay, they look different. The Harbor Bridge looks very different to the Brooklyn Bridge, right? Sydney Harbor Bridge. But, like underlying mechanisms are similar-ish, right? Unless you're a bridge architect or an engineer, you're not going to be able to tell the differences and what the trade-offs are, right? For the end user, they just want to drive their car from one end to the other and not have it collapse on them while they're on the bridge, right? And so the only way that you really, I think, build up that confidence again is through Lindy, right? Just through having a lot of assets bridged, having time. The longer you go without a bridge hack, the more confidence people will have in it. And so this is just going to be a process where over the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to have to build up that confidence and get people to a point where they feel very confident that using the bridge between Optimism and L1 is a very safe activity. But ultimately, you shouldn't even need to use that bridge because you shouldn't be on L1 in the first place. Right? Like the question is why you use it on L1, right? Yeah, you should be beginning on the L2, right? So if you're L2 native, like a lot of projects are these days, there's no bridge problem because you just stay on L2. You stay, on Arbitrum or Optimism, and that's it.
And I think, for us, we built a layer 2 design protocol using Gnosis Safe where things are a lot cheaper. You can do a lot of very interesting multi-sig wallet type of thing that would be inefficient and impossible to do. The tough part is getting fiat on and off ramp on these things. So we're only seeing beginning of gesture from people who have those, operation supporting with open arms, layer 2 for USDC or even DAI assets, and that seems to be maybe for trading it's a little bit less important, and you can do that later on. But for more commerce stuff, which is what we work on closer to, kind of like dealing with software subscription, that's kind of our niche. It's hard to get your earnings out, and you have to bridge it, and it's like that's like $25 or risks that comes in. Is a big problem. But I do expect a lot of new of these compliant providers to start seeing the volume and say, I got to be where my customers are.
Exactly. And, centralized exchanges are already starting to support that. So it's a matter of time. And then, ultimately what it comes down to is you need to build the ecosystem such that people don't need to exit it. Right. If someone is earning money in that ecosystem and can spend it in that ecosystem without even leaving the ecosystem, that's when you really solve the problem. Right. Because, you don't even need to bridge out. You just have access to, okay, I earn revenue here and I have expenses here and I buy things in that same place. I don't need to go anywhere else. I don't need to convert it out or leave the ecosystem.
Yeah, and then that could mean that you need adapters into like, credit card tied to a Gnosis Safe or something like that. But, right now people are still very much like, oh, how do you make that bridge, make that connection between the two worlds? Some of them it's a loans against your portfolio, but, hopefully we have systems where we can just authorize from your Gnosis Safe. That would be ideal, but I don't think we have the speed to do that yet, but I'm sure that gap between, we're not quite there. The technology will have to get a lot better to have confidence to be hooked into the authorization network. I'm sure you have a lot of experience in that in your payment thing. So how far do you think we are from spending our Gnosis Safe with the Visa card?
I mean, it feels like, this is the type of thing that's like been 2 years away for, it's always kind of 2 years away for 8 years, But I do think that in the next, in this next cycle, as we build out a lot of the infrastructure, obviously in a bear market, which I still think we're in, a lot of infrastructure gets built. A lot of the money that was invested in the bull market gets, deployed. And that's where you start to get some really cool stuff being built. So I do think that we will see a bunch of new, cool things that kind of come out of this bear market, which will put us in a much better position. If we're ready to scale when the next bull market starts, that's when, more institutional, traditional finance players get excited again, right? And when they get excited and can immediately do something, and the tech is there and the platforms are there and the infrastructure is there, it makes it much easier. If you get someone excited about something and then tell them, yeah, I know you're really excited to do this today, but we can't do it for another 2 years, they disappear. But if they can do it straight away, that will change things. So I think it's really important that we continue to build scaling infrastructure, build these networks, build the bridges, build all of this tech, and get to a point where, someone like a Visa or something can just turn up and do their own integration, and it's not, a multi-year process.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of attempt to kind of paper over the fact that there are two incompatible infrastructure, and I think they can be brought together. Do you think time to finality is important? Obviously, when I had some conversations about credit card processing and finality, they say, well, Avalanche as an L1, can give you that 1 second finality could be useful in some of these use cases. Obviously, a lot of the Ethereum upgrades are not really changing the finality timeframe. What's your sense that can Ethereum keep up if finality time become important?
So here's a fun fact for you. Visa and MasterCard and all of the credit card rails do not have finality. There's no such thing. There's no concept of finality. You can literally roll back a transaction in perpetuity. So the concept of chargebacks, if any of the listeners or people watching this video have had any interaction with e-commerce, chargebacks are a thing, and chargebacks are basically breaking finality, right? So a transaction happened, the funds were received by the counterparty, and then 180 days later, or even years later, someone turns up and says, actually, no, that was a fraudulent transaction. The transaction was rolled back by the bank or by the payment processor. So this idea that you need 1 second finality to support Visa is crazy, because Visa doesn't have finality at all. They don't believe in finality. So I think it's not a necessary condition for integrations into banks. In fact, one of the reasons why I think that crypto payments and crypto payment rails are better is because you actually do have finality where you don't have finality in the traditional finance world. So it's somewhat ironic that finality is something that people focus on when it's not actually a real thing.
Yeah, and then the thing about it is that with finality, you can build chargebacks. You can build a mechanism to do that. And that's the interesting thing that people don't realize, is that they set a compromise in the current banking rails and the payment rails. And then if you have a technology that has finality, you can reconstruct, similar to how you can build a protocol to do Synthetix, you can reconstruct a lot of the useful feature without the trade-offs and the fuzziness of it.
Or with lower trade-offs, right? Or it's a different set of trade-offs,
Yeah, or with trade-offs that you can kind of spec out in the protocol. I mean, you can certainly do refunds in crypto if you escrow some funds in a pool, and you can put that together. But it will be more intentional, not an accident of lack of finality through chargebacks. That's so interesting to look at that. And I think there's been some obsessions over TPS for visas and visas, time that we forget that we actually building a different set of tools that may actually solve the problem differently, but in some way better. I'm personally quite bullish on crypto payments.
Ultra high TPS, So so am I. I've always believed that we'll get there. I think rollups are sufficient. Rollups plus some of the EIPs that are being worked on to really scale things up, and then obviously the execution layer. Shifting away from L1 and L1 becoming this kind of a state maintenance layer that will help. So I think there's a bunch of things that we will see over the next 12 to 18 months, maybe 2 years, that will allow crypto payments to be much more competitive. But I still think that one of the biggest issues we're going to have is we need to build an ecosystem of payments where people can earn money in crypto and spend it in crypto and stay crypto native. And we're not there yet. So long as people need to exit out to fiat in order to be able to like live in the real world, we're not. So we need to bootstrap that somehow and get that momentum going. And then once we do that, then it becomes easier to bring other people into that ecosystem and keep them there, as opposed to constantly needing to exit to fiat. The fiat exiting process is, I think, too high friction to allow this to work in the short term.
Yeah, it's the ultimate bridge problem, right? It's like exiting into the ocean.
That's the cash. Yeah, I know.
Right? Strap in your bag, like I am going on a journey to the unknown. Let's maybe wrap up and talk a little bit about the kind of the near term for the Synthetix project. You mentioned there's a lot of very exciting development coming. One of which that was really interesting to kind of get your thoughts on is the new governance module. Obviously, there's a lot of governance theater, right? It's like, governance is a way for us to punt on something, keep the regulator on base something, give the token holder something to do. What's your sense about doing more substantive type of governance that actually tap into the knowledge and understanding and alignment without just doing it as a thing to do because it's the thing to do? So what's your thoughts about governance in general? And what specifically in Synthetix are you pushing for?
So I think Synthetix has been at the forefront of decentralized governance for a long time, but it's still not there yet, right? There's still aspects of Synthetix governance that are discretionary, that could be a attack surface for a motivated actor that's trying to censor the protocol or trying to block the protocol in some way. And ultimately, I wrote a blog post about this years and years ago. If we want these protocols to be truly unstoppable, we need all of the different attack surface, and areas of attack to be addressed. And governance is a critical one. At different times, some of them are in ascendancy and some of them are less problematic. Even if we look at today, communication is critical, right? And if communication is happening in Discord, and Discord, your Discord can be shut off like that, that's problematic, right? And we're not even close to solving that problem. So, there are a number of aspects that are problematic. But when we look at specifically governance, governance is the process of making decisions, but communication is a key. Governance breaks if you can't talk to each other, right? We need a way to be able to speak to each other in a sort of censorship-resistant fashion. Now we can all create a giant signal channel, right? And maybe try and use that. I don't know if Signal scales up to 150,000 people in the way that Discord does.
Not in one channel, probably.
Probably not, right? So these are problems, right? Like these are problems that need to be addressed in order for governance to really work. And you have to look at it holistically. You can't just look at the actual decision-making process. You need to look at all the inputs in decision-making. But you still need a robust process. And so, the new Synthetix governance module will be able to take a bunch of these inputs, right? It doesn't solve Discord, it doesn't solve, Telegram, it doesn't solve all these things. But what it does solve is that once the community has made a decision, it gives the community the power to enforce that decision fully on chain, which I think right now, the reliance on Gnosis Safe means that you've got this off-chain social consensus layer, which, is somewhat problematic. So we want to remove that so that you don't need to be reliant on multi-sig signers to execute transactions, that the token holders themselves and their representatives can directly make changes on chain.
Yeah, and then I think, I know the Gnosis ecosystem, we're Safeguardian at Cardstack, and it's trying to add the Zodiac module for like delays and wiring this up. And I think that's just directions towards a thing. But I think it's important to not lost your email and someone fall asleep and then somehow just hold up, because that person is just like, I have no internet connection. I didn't even know that something passes, right?
I know, right?
So is the governance going to be on L1 or L2?
It'll be on L2. The cost of governance is too high on L1. You can't put people in a position where the cost of voting is $5 or something like that. It's not viable.
Yeah, you just make the people who have more ETH, have more say, effectively a tax on participation.
Exactly.
You mentioned this idea that the aspects of coordination, of which governance may be an outcome, is definitely something we're still as an ecosystem extremely reliant on centralized party. But one aspect that is also pretty reliant is that there are still like web hosting infrastructure that we need to do to put the front end of these dApps or whatever it might be in addition to the like kind of on top of the protocol. And I think recent events made people more aware of the UI and the difference between the dApp, the UI, the hosted aspects of it, and then the protocol itself. Do you think the decentralization of UI, which, early experiments from Aragon was like, hey, use this governance module in Aragon, download this application, you have a node running, and you're running your own web server, for lack of a better way of saying it. Do we have to go to that to get that type of decentralization? Is it a set of trade-offs, as you mentioned? What's your view on the decentralized UI need, especially with the recent events?
So I've actually been working with a project that is solving this problem, and independently, Synthetix obviously has been thinking about decentralization for a long time, right? And as I said, we've got this like list of things that we need, we worry about at different times, right? And the dApp layer has always been, in the top probably 2 or 3 things that we worry about. And so we went multiple times and looked at different designs for how we could solve this. We've obviously, done stuff like deployed IPFS and all that.
Right.
But unfortunately, all of these solutions have pretty harsh trade-offs in terms of performance. And it just makes it, a backup, but not really a usable primary mechanism for interacting with the protocol. And I think in order for this solution to really work, it needs to be the primary mechanism that people use. And so there's a project that I've been working with now for about 6 months that is in stealth, but is about to come out of stealth, hopefully. And I think that they have solved this. They independently came up with a similar architecture to what Synthetix had been kind of looking at doing internally, but it was going to be too hard to build for us. It was the resource required to build this was going to be too high. So thankfully, this project has kind of turned up, and they've got a really novel solution, I think, that we haven't yet seen kind of implemented. So I'm super excited for that. Hopefully, they're going to be out of stealth in the next couple of weeks. And I think they have the potential to be the kind of decentralized dApp hosting layer that we've all been kind of waiting for in DeFi, and obviously, very timely given recent events.
Yeah, I think, web developer who are not in Web3 but has some Web2 are very, very like up to speed on, is it at the edge? Is it going to come out fast? Is it going to come from origin? These are all trade-offs that I think in Web3 we haven't really thought about. If you're doing like a social media platform, those are the e-commerce platform, for social commerce platform, that is like, how quickly does this little Kardashian promo load up? I mean, that has a conversion curve that drops steeply, right? So there are crazy, definitely solutions. Yeah. It's very crazy. And I did some work in that area with social commerce, and, the measurement of milliseconds of response time changes the entire structure. Because what it's like 3 seconds for TikTok, even you watch it, right? Like you're just in this tremendously fast thing. So I think crypto is starting to realize the drop-off curve of performance as being an important 100%.
Thing. It's not as bad if you have enthusiasts, right? Enthusiasts are willing to put up with a lot of bullshit to be enthusiastic, right? Like that's not a problem. But once you get to like genuine end users, and especially at scale, the time, the kind of time impact of latency is huge, right? If you've got 1 billion people looking at something, and you look at the curve, every millisecond is like 100,000 people drop off, right? Like that's hugely
and
impactful.
It's pretty steep, and then what you lose in the beginning is way more than what you lose later on.
Huge.
So performance, I think it's another scalability metric. Yeah, absolutely.
Agreed.
Agreed. So, I think one other thing I just want to touch on is that, the need for messaging, right? You mentioned that Discord and stuff like that. And what's your view on the new kind of like this generation Signal coming, not Signal, maybe Signal and Status coming back to say, hey, wallet-to-wallet communication. Do you think that's healthy for us to leverage the Ethereum ecosystem and technology stack, Waku, V2, Wallet Connect, going into that? What's your thoughts on that?
I think we will get there. again, it's not an easy problem to solve, right? Like Discord is not an easy platform to build. In Web3, we build really hard stuff at the contract level. And so we kind of hand wave. We're like, oh, Discord, that's not difficult, right?
Yeah.
But Discord is not an easy thing to build at scale, right? There's, millions and millions of people using it. There's a reason why it's centralized, right? Replacing something like Discord with a decentralized solution, we're, in my view, not close to that, right? Like, I think we're probably years away from that, unless someone comes up with something pretty miraculous in terms of scalability. Wallet-to-wallet communication is great. It's a good backup, but I look at it as kind of similar to like the IPFS thing. Like having your dApp hosted on IPFS is great, but the average person is not going to use that every day. They're going to use it maybe if it's a critical outage or something like that. Wallet-to-wallet communication is just not at a point yet where I think you can use it as like a day-to-day messaging service.
That's true.
Maybe in 6 months' time we can get there. But yeah, in the short term, I think no chance. And for larger scale communication, like a Discord type community with 100,000 people in it, I think we're still way away from that.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Maybe I can imagine it being like an OTC request to buy some ape or swap an ape for something. That may work, but like for multi-party communication, I think we've been tracking this project called Matrix. Obviously, it's an open source Slack clone or something like that, and even that project has to do a rewrite a couple of times to get better performance. They were on a Python code base, and they had to do a Go code base just to get the single server performance up. But you still have a clustering problem. Again, not easy solution. And I don't know if you've seen that famous flow chart. Like, when do you notify someone in a Slack group? There's a lot of rules that come in. It's not just like ping the phone every single time if someone sent a message, right? So it's a tough problem. Well, this has been really great, kind of getting a sense of like your roadmap and what you're working on and what is important. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the community about like what's next, and when you're speaking next, and what topics you're interested in as we kind of hopefully take some time to gather ourselves, but also prepare ourselves for the next set of work that comes with the new season?
Yeah, so I'm going to be in New York in September for the Chainlink conference and for mainnet. So I'm looking forward to that. And on the Synthetix side, I think the primary thing that we're working on right now is V3. So basically a complete redesign of the protocol from the ground up. The existing code base is getting close to 4 years old now. We're coming up on 4 years, which is a long time in smart contract land.
It's 4 decades.
Some of the contracts, some of the contracts on mainnet are like some of the oldest still functioning contracts, right? Like, if you exclude like WETH and some of the like really, really OG contracts, like contracts that people still use today, some of those Synthetix contracts that are out there, there isn't much older, unfortunately. So, it's going to be a complete redesign, re-architecture from scratch, and then a redeployment natively to Optimism. And hopefully that's coming later in the year. So super excited for that.
How old is staking rewards.so?
I think the first iteration of staking rewards.so is 3 years old now. It's probably coming up on the anniversary of 3 years. It's pretty close. It was July. It was like July, August that Anton wrote that code. So yeah, it would be 3 years. It might have just had its 3-year birthday.
Wow!
Like maybe
when you ever retire that, you got to have a ceremony, because that is probably the most used codes and most copy and pasted code in Ethereum history.
I should go and track it down. I need to find out what its birthday is. We should be tweeting about that.
Yeah, I think it's awesome. I mean, it's a hidden thing, but it's if you know kind of thing. That is absolutely
exactly.
If you know. So, well, thank you so much for your contribution to ecosystem, and a big fan of your work. Thanks, and offers and everything. And as always, the community, we do this every Wednesday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. And thank you, Kain, for your insight today. And until next time, take care.
All right, thank you. See ya.
Bye.